leadership and how they were affecting the country. So with that in mind, do you think we learned anything new from the Prime Minister in that interview this morning?
Well, we did learn a couple of things, but probably not the things that the Prime Minister was either meant or intended us to know. The first was the apparent slip of the tongue, subsequently tried to be explained away, that the King's cancer has been caught early, which was clearly one thing that Buckingham Palace were not wanting to tell us one way or the other. And the other was, I think, an apparent confirmation, at least in terms of the way in which he tried to steer away from the question. The Prime Minister was somewhat surprised by Piers Morgan in his interview the previous day on television, where Mr. Morgan had challenged the Prime Minister to a 1,000 bet that there wouldn't be anybody sent to Rwanda before the election. Mr. Sunak shook Piers Morgan's hands without quite saying it was a deal. And I think perhaps, as he himself said this morning, I'm not a betting man, and it's not entirely clear whether he realised he was actually accepting a bet or not. But so far as policy is concerned, as you've heard in that clip, the Prime Minister stuck to his guns, surprise, surprise, and tried to present a portrayal of the position on the various issues on which he was challenged, to suggest that maybe things weren't so bad after all. Indeed, perhaps from his point of view, actually beginning to go rather better. But whether or not, frankly, these arguments have been heard repeatedly before. Of course, one of the jobs of politicians is to keep on saying the same thing in the hope that eventually you convince the public. The question that hangs over this Prime Minister is that so far his attempts since he became Prime Minister in the wake of Liz Truss's disastrous short tenure in October 2022 is that he's not really demonstrated so far any discernible progress in persuading the public that his government should be re-elected.
I thought Rachel Burdon did a really good job of the interview. But from the outside looking in, John Curtice, do you think there's any significance in it being a 5 Live interview? Do you think he was speaking to a particular audience there?
Yeah, well, I think certainly it's interesting that this is the third sort of an interview he seems to have thrown himself into, first with GB News, a news channel that is widely thought to be somewhat sympathetic to the Conservative Party. Talk TV, again, not entirely unsympathetic to the Conservative point of view. And now Radio 5 Live. And of course, Radio 5 certainly attracts a fairly wide-ranging audience, but I think in particular has a style which tries to present the news in terms that touch the lives of ordinary people, rather than necessarily those who talk in policy speak around SW1. And Rachel Burdon, a lot of her challenges, of course, were to the Prime Minister about, well, look, what about this situation that this person is having to deal with? And they can't get their dental appointment, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the problems that this revealed for the Prime Minister, and why this perhaps was not necessarily a format in which he particularly shines, is he doesn't find it that easy to empathise with people's individual problems and, as it were, demonstrate an apparent understanding. He is somebody who thinks more broadly, as he himself has said in this interview. Look, I can't necessarily solve, he didn't quite say this, but he said effectively, I can't necessarily deal with people's individual problems. I have to try to work out about policy for the good of all. Well, that is true, but it's not necessarily the most effective way of dealing with the kind of interview that Rachel Burdon was presenting him with.
And John, I was in the car for about 4.5 hours today, driving down from Scotland to Salford, and I heard a lot of our listeners ringing in and saying the same thing about, well, the cost of living is still really affecting us, but he was positioning it as inflation's coming down, we're winning that battle. But do you think those points he was trying to enforce landed? Because I didn't really get the sense that's how they landed with the audience when I was listening today.
Well, the truth is that probably on the two issues on which he was particularly challenged, which is the economy, stroke cost of living, and to the NHS, going back to the kind of boring academic research that I do, as opposed to the thing of talking to people, but it points to the same conclusion, that if you want to understand why this government is in trouble and why it's lost votes, well, in one, it's Boris Johnson and Partygate. Two, it's the perception that this government has not handled the economy well. Now, of course, that's not all Rishi Sunak's fault. It's primarily the fact that because of the Liz Truss experience, it's very, very easy for the opposition to blame the government for the state of the economy, and for that than to be a legacy from which Mr. Sunak can escape. And the third thing, and this is something where he's admitted in recent days, he's not made much progress, but is then wanting to blame the doctors for going on strike, is the fact that the NHS has record waiting times. The Prime Minister today referred to a reduction in cancer waiting times over a very short time period. The brutal truth is that far more people now are waiting for some form of NHS appointment or procedure than any time point in the past. And again, it's very, very clear from doing quantitative analysis that this is the other crucial issue that's hanging around the government's neck. And the problem is, of course, is that these are pretty difficult things to solve, and certainly getting increasingly difficult to solve in the increasingly limited time that's left between now and the general election.
He seemed determined to turn the conversation about the bet back to Rwanda, and that's the other main issue, isn't it? Immigration. How do you feel that he handled that topic? Because it is a massive fault line in the current Conservative government.
Well, it's not just a fault line within the Conservative government causing divisions within the party. It's also a clear fault line between the Conservative and Labour Party. There's this one issue on which the Labour Party is quite willing to say, we do not believe in this policy. And the truth is, people who are inclined to vote Labour tend to be disinclined to support the Rwanda policy. Those who would vote Conservative are. The problem for the government is that once you do that kind of analysis we were talking about earlier, yes, what you discover is for a lot of people who voted Conservative in 2019 are upset about the level of immigration, not just illegal immigration, as the government wants to call it, but also legal immigration, which of course has been a record high. But it seems to be what one might call a bite your lip issue for many Conservatives. In other words, they're unhappy about it. But if that's all you're unhappy about with this government, you tend to be still willing to stick with it. You're not sure that anybody else is going to do any better. And so, at least until very recently, it was not clear that people's views about immigration were actually amongst the things that were persuading people not to vote Conservative anymore. Now, some sign that maybe, most recently that's no longer true, i.e. that the government, in making the issue more salient by focusing on it, may indeed have reminded some people that they've not been doing terribly well on this, and that as a result, the Reform Party, which of course takes a hard line on immigration, may have profited as a result. In other words, by focusing on a subject which probably was never going to help the government recover electorally, may have actually made things slightly worse by reminding people of a failure and persuading some to go off to reform. The truth is the government's wanted to focus on immigration. It also still believes that tax cuts may be a way back to the hearts of the electorate, but the evidence otherwise is that no, until you solve the problem of our public services and above all the health service, that is going to be a lower priority than sorting the public services out. The government actually needs to focus on the things that so far it's been disinclined to focus on: the economy, the NHS, and making it very clear that they do not necessarily endorse what happened under Boris Johnson during the COVID pandemic, something that so far Rishi Sunak has signally failed to do.
Professor John Curtice, you get the feeling here that he's talking to the media more, the Prime Minister, at the moment than normal. So do you see these interviews as a sort of soft election launch?
Well, I mean, look, you are talking about a Prime Minister who finds himself still, 19, 20 points behind in the polls. We should not be surprised that he is trying to persuade the public. No, Sir Keir Starmer is on Times Radio today. I mean, inevitably, as we get into the election period, we can expect our leaders to be wanting to try to persuade us more. But, the Prime Minister, above all, particularly needs to do so. And, perhaps the strategy seems to be, so far at least, to try to start with some of those television and radio stations that he's hoping might be somewhat softer interviews in which he can get his message across without necessarily being interrogated too much by the interviewer. But I'm not sure, in truth, both because of the things that he said that weren't about policy and then what he did say about policy, that this particular interview necessarily did him any good. But look, his job is to keep on trying. And, we have to respect he wants to keep on trying. And, he's, of course, as the Prime Minister, perfectly entitled to try to keep on trying.
John, you mentioned there the Conservatives are 20 points behind in the polls. But with that in mind, when do you think the election will actually happen?
14th of November is now very much everybody's bet. it's long struck me is that you have to realise in the end this is a personal decision made by the Prime Minister. A lot of people were saying earlier, go in the spring, Conservatives might not suffer so badly, can get back into office maybe after a couple of years. The trouble is that's not the calculation that Rishi Sunak faces. If he loses, however badly he loses, his political career is over. He will not be allowed to remain as leader of the Conservative Party. He never got voted by activists. It will be curtains for him. Therefore, he has a choice between banking at least the 2 years, at least he knows he can have as Prime Minister, or risking it all after 18 months. It has never long not been obvious to me why he should want to risk it after 18 months. At least bank the 2 years, probably get on the statute book his plans for gradually increasing the age at which you can legally buy cigarettes. And it may well be that that's the thing that he's remembered for, that when, the children who are not yet born are doing their British history in 20, 30 years' time, and we get to the relatively short premiership of Rishi Sunak, but this is the Prime Minister that has gradually meant that none of you are ever going to smoke a cigarette in your life. And that, is arguably a bigger legacy than many prime ministers leave. Then why particularly November? Well, all the parties have decided to put their party conferences rather early. These are money spinners for them. We're probably not going to get Parliament meeting in September as we usually do. The last conference is the Conservative conference. It closes on the 2nd of October with the Prime Minister's speech. And that's probably when the election's going to be announced.
The difference between legacy and lettuce, I think you're saying there, John. What about voter turnout? Keir Starmer was talking quite a lot about apathy. And I remember when we talked 10 years ago about the independence referendum, turnout was a big conversation. I think turnout in the European referendum was a big conversation again. It feels like people are politically motivated at the moment. The cost of living crisis is huge. Immigration's huge. Economy's huge. So how do you see this one turning out then in terms of people in the ballot box?
The trouble at the moment is that one can see more reasons as to why the turnout is going to be low rather than high. And I would pick out three, two of which at least, past evidence certainly points in this direction. The first is that there is relatively little difference between the parties on many issues. The fact the Labour Party has steered back towards the centre, much as it did under Tony Blair. The experience under New Labour was that helped to depress turnout. The second reason is that if the polls remain as they are, a lot of people are going to go, what's the point of voting? It's obvious who's going to win. They may be wrong, but that's the conclusion that they may draw. And then thirdly, I think what we also have to say is that neither Mr. Sunak nor Sir Keir Starmer enthuse the public. It's actually very difficult to think of a previous period certainly since the 1950s, when we have been presented with party leaders, and here I frankly would also include Sir Ed Davey. I'd also include Hamza Yusuf, the leader of the SNP. We have never really had such an uncharismatic, in the eyes of many voters, dull leaders. Now, they have many, all of them have admirable professional qualities, but none of them particularly have the skill set that is required for political leadership, which is an ability to set a narrative, to set a sense of direction, and to get people in behind that with a degree of enthusiasm. We have on the one hand a Prime Minister who gets involved in detail, but who seems to veer from one subject to another, and there's no overall sense of strategy. The whole seems to be less than the sum of the parts. And we have an opposition leader who is very good at filleting other people's arguments. That's what he learned as a prosecution lawyer.
And that was
but as a leader, you have to be able to set a vision. You have to write your own brief, not rely on the brief of your client. And that's where Sir Keir still seems to find it difficult. So he's good at PMQs at attacking his opponent, not so good at enthusiasing the electorate about what he might achieve if he is indeed Britain's next Prime Minister.
Professor St John